The legend of the sunken town of Hollowbrook had been whispered among the locals for generations. It was said that the town was cursed, a place where the dead did not rest, and where shadows clung to the remnants of the drowned buildings like hungry specters. No one ventured there, not even the most daring fishermen or thrill-seeking tourists. The waters were treacherous, the depths hiding secrets too horrifying to contemplate. But that didn't stop Daniel and his friends. They were an adventurous group, always looking for the next thrill. The idea of exploring a submerged ghost town thrilled them in a way nothing else could. They had heard the stories, of course, how the town had been hastily evacuated over a century ago when the river dam burst, flooding the entire area in a matter of hours. How the residents had no time to escape, and many had drowned in their homes, their bodies never recovered. How, on certain nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear their screams bubbling up from the depths. Daniel, however, was convinced it was all just superstition. He scoffed at the warnings, his bravado infecting the others. They planned their trip meticulously, securing diving gear and underwater cameras. The expedition was set for a moonless night, when the lake would be at its darkest, adding an extra layer of tension to their adventure. The night of the dive, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As they descended into the inky black water, the beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the murky depths. The water was cold, unnaturally so, and a heavy silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of their breathing through the oxygen tanks. The first structures they encountered were mere outlines, ghostly in the dim light. A steeple protruded from the silt, the cross at its peak twisted and corroded. The skeletal remains of houses loomed around them, their windows like empty eye sockets staring into the void. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the fear down, determined not to show any weakness. As they swam deeper into the town, the water grew colder, and an oppressive feeling settled over them. Daniel couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. His friends were close by, but he felt a distinct chill creeping up his spine, like icy fingers trailing along his back. They came upon the town square, where the remains of a statue stood half-buried in silt. The figure was unrecognizable, its features worn away by decades of water erosion, but there was something unsettling about it. It seemed almost alive, as though it were waiting for something or someone. Then, the first scream echoed through the water, a distorted wail that sent shivers down their spines. Daniel spun around, his flashlight beam dancing frantically through the murk. There was nothing there, just the silent buildings and the ever-present darkness. But the scream had been real, he was sure of it. Another scream, this time closer. The group huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. They could feel the water around them growing colder, almost freezing. The sound of chains rattling, the groans of the long dead, and the whispers began to fill their ears. They were not alone. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, faint at first, like pale wraiths moving with a ghostly grace. They were the drowned, the spirits of those who had perished when the town was submerged. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, eyes black and lifeless. They reached out with skeletal hands, their touch icy, their mouths opening in soundless screams. Panic set in. Daniel and his friends tried to swim back to the surface, but the water seemed to thicken around them, like a living entity intent on pulling them down. The more they struggled, the more the shadows closed in, the drowned souls surrounding them, blocking their escape. Daniel's light flickered, then went out, plunging him into complete darkness. He could hear his friends' muffled cries, their frantic thrashing in the water. He reached out, trying to find them, but his hands grasped only cold, empty water. Then, something grabbed his leg, a grip like iron, cold and relentless. Daniel kicked out, but the hold tightened, pulling him down, deeper into the abyss. He felt another hand on his arm, then another, until he was enveloped by the dead, their faces inches from his own, their hollow eyes staring into his soul. A voice, raspy and filled with malice, whispered in his ear, "Join us." Daniel's body was numb with cold, his lungs burning as he struggled to hold onto the last bit of air in his lungs. The whisper echoed in his mind, a haunting call that made his blood run cold. He thrashed desperately, but the hands of the dead held firm, their icy fingers digging into his flesh, dragging him further into the blackness. His vision blurred as the darkness closed in, but then he saw it, a light, faint and distant, cutting through the abyss like a beacon. For a moment, hope flared in his chest, and with a final burst of strength, he kicked upward, towards the light. The grip on his limbs loosened, as if the spirits were reluctant to let him go, but still, they pulled back, vanishing into the shadows. Daniel broke through the surface, gasping for breath, his lungs burning as he sucked in the cold night air. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the world around him was a blur. He could barely make out the shapes of his friends, flailing in the water, their screams mingling with the howling wind. The light was coming from the boat, a lone lantern, swaying in the wind, casting long, eerie shadows over the churning water. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he swam towards it, his limbs heavy and sluggish, as if the water itself was trying to pull him back. His friends were close behind, their eyes wide with terror, their faces pale and ghostly in the dim light. They reached the boat, clawing their way aboard, their bodies trembling with cold and fear. Daniel collapsed on the deck, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind was racing, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of terror and disbelief. He could still feel the icy grip of the dead on his skin, their hollow eyes boring into his soul. But as he looked around, he realized that something was wrong. The boat was empty, no sign of their pilot, no equipment, nothing, just the lantern, flickering ominously in the wind. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a cold dread settling in the pit of his stomach. Where is everyone? Sarah, one of his friends, stammered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted around, wild with fear. Daniel shook his head, unable to form the words. His mind was a haze of fear and confusion. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking, and stumbled towards the helm. The boat was adrift, floating aimlessly in the dark water. The shoreline was nowhere to be seen, lost in the fog that had rolled in, thick and impenetrable. As Daniel reached for the wheel, a low, guttural moan echoed from below deck, freezing him in place. His breath caught in his throat as he turned towards the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. His friends huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. The moan grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the boat like the wail of a dying animal. Daniel swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and slowly descended the steps to the lower deck. The air grew colder with each step, a damp, musty odor filling his nostrils. The lantern flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the walls. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Daniel's foot hit something solid, and he froze. He looked down, and his blood ran cold. It was a body. The corpse was bloated, the skin pale and waxy, the eyes wide open and staring lifelessly into the void. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, teeth bared in a rectus of death. Daniel gagged, his stomach heaving as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over another body. They were everywhere, dozens of them, piled haphazardly on the floor, their lifeless eyes staring up at him, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Some were still dripping wet, their clothes tattered and torn, as if they had just been pulled from the water. Daniel's mind reeled, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of the horror before him. The bodies were fresh, too fresh, as if they had only just died. But how was that possible? They were alone out here, weren't they? Then he saw it, the symbol. Carved into the forehead of each corpse was a strange, twisted symbol, jagged and angular, like a mark of ownership. It was the same symbol that had been etched into the statue they had seen in the town square, the one that had sent chills down their spines. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The lantern flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. The moan echoed through the room once more, louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the bodies. It was coming from the water. Daniel spun around, his eyes wide with terror as he saw the water beginning to rise, seeping up through the cracks in the floorboards, dark and thick like tar. It bubbled and churned, as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. The boat groaned, the wood creaking and splintering as the water continued to rise, faster now, filling the lower deck. The bodies began to float, their lifeless forms bobbing in the dark water, their eyes still fixed on Daniel, their mouths still twisted in that grotesque grin. He turned and bolted up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the water rising behind him, the sound of it sloshing against the walls, the creak and groan of the boat as it began to tip under the weight. Bursting onto the deck, Daniel shouted at his friends, "We need to get out of here, now." But as he spoke, the fog parted, revealing something that made his blood turn to ice. The town, the ghostly remains of Hollowbrook, its drowned buildings looming out of the water like the skeletal remains of some long-dead beast. They had drifted back to where it all began, and standing on the shore, waiting for them, were the drowned. They were watching, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths open in silent screams. The water around the boat churned violently, and Daniel realized with horror that the spirits weren't going to let them go. They had been lured here, trapped by the very town they had come to explore. As the first of the drowned began to rise from the water, their twisted, decayed forms pulling themselves onto the deck, Daniel knew with a sickening certainty that there would be no escape. The air was thick with the stench of decay as the drowned spirits clambered onto the deck, their bodies waterlogged and twisted, their movements unnatural and jerky. Daniel's friends screamed in terror, scrambling to the far end of the boat, but there was no escape. The fog had closed in around them, thick as a shroud, the shoreline now nothing more than a distant memory. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the advancing figures, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But as he looked into the lifeless eyes of the drowned, he realized with a cold dread that they were doomed. The first of the spirits lunged at him, its cold, clammy hands wrapping around his throat with a strength that belied its decayed appearance. Daniel struggled, gasping for breath as the icy grip tightened, his vision blurring at the edges. He kicked out, desperate to break free, but the spirit was relentless, its hollow eyes boring into his, filled with an insatiable hunger. Just as Daniel thought he was about to black out, the spirit was ripped away from him, dragged back into the water by some unseen force. Gasping for breath, Daniel stumbled back, his hand clutching at his throat. His friends were faring no better, each of them grappling with the spirits, their screams echoing through the fog. The boat rocked violently, the water around it churning as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. The moaning grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The drowned spirits paused, their heads tilting as if listening, their eyes glowing with that eerie, unnatural light. Then, the water exploded. A massive shape rose from the depths, a twisted, grotesque mass of flesh and bone, its form writhing and undulating like a living nightmare. It was the town itself, a monstrous amalgamation of the spirits that had been trapped there, fused together by centuries of torment and rage. The buildings had twisted into a grotesque, living thing, the windows like eyes, the doorways like gaping mouths, all filled with the howling souls of the damned. The boat was lifted into the air, tossed like a toy as the creature rose higher, its many limbs thrashing through the water, sending waves crashing against the hull. Daniel was thrown to the deck, his head slamming against the wood, stars exploding in his vision. He could hear his friends screaming, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of the creature, a sound so loud it shook the very air. Daniel staggered to his feet, his body aching, his head spinning. The creature loomed above them, its many eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, its mouths opening and closing as if tasting the air. The drowned spirits moved towards it, their bodies dissolving into mist as they were absorbed into the creature, becoming one with the living nightmare. And then, it turned its gaze on Daniel. The eyes of the creature bore into him, filling his mind with a searing pain, as if his very soul was being torn apart. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, screaming as the pain intensified, 1,000 voices echoing in his mind, all of them crying out in torment. Through the pain, Daniel saw his friends, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes wide and lifeless. The creature had consumed them, their souls torn from their bodies, their screams joining the chorus of the damned that echoed through the fog. Daniel's vision blurred, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The creature loomed closer, its many mouths opening wide, ready to devour him, to pull him into its endless darkness. But then, through the haze of pain and terror, Daniel saw something. A light, faint and distant, flickering in the depths of the creature's many eyes. It was the same light he had seen earlier, the one that had led him to the surface. It was a beacon, a lifeline, the last vestige of hope in this sea of despair. With the last of his strength, Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against the light. And as he did, the world exploded into blinding white. For a moment, there was nothing but the light, a searing brightness that washed away the pain, the fear, the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. Daniel blinked, his vision slowly clearing. He was no longer on the boat, no longer surrounded by the twisted, nightmarish form of the creature. He was on the shore, the cold, damp sand beneath his hands, the fog lifting to reveal the calm waters of the lake, the sun just beginning to rise on the horizon. He was alone. The boat, the creature, his friends. Everything was gone, as if it had never been. The town of Hollowbrook was nowhere to be seen, the water still and undisturbed, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But Daniel knew better. He could still feel the icy grip of the drowned on his skin, still hear the echo of their screams in his mind. The symbol that had been carved into the foreheads of the dead was burned into his memory, a mark he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had survived, but he had been marked, claimed by the town and the spirits that lingered there. The light that had saved him was fading, the last remnants of hope in a world that had been consumed by darkness. As he stood on the shore, staring out at the still waters, Daniel knew that the horrors of Hollowbrook were far from over. The town was waiting, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rise again. And when it did, it would come for him. Because no one escapes the submerged ghost town. Not forever.